Okay, these are going to be the notes for Standard 2C, and we're going to describe the development of Chinese civilization under the Zhou and Qin dynasty. Z-H-O-U, we're going to pronounce that Zhou, and Q-I-N, Qin. So Chinese civilization developed initially along the Huanghe River, and we used to call that the Yellow River. And the reason it had that name is because it was a very yellow-looking river. There is a yellowish silt called loess that is found in that river. You can see the picture there. But that's why we Westerners used to call it the Yellow River. But the name is Huanghe. So the very first Chinese dynasty, according to legend, is the Xia dynasty, led by the king or the emperor Yu, Y-U. Now, we know that the Shang dynasty existed, so this would have replaced the Xia dynasty around 1700 BC. You can see on the map there the borders of this dynasty, this Chinese civilization. So some things about the Shang dynasty. Culturally, the family was very important. Chinese civilization was patriarchal, meaning that the eldest male in the family ruled the household. So that would be like you living in a house where your grandpa is kind of the head of the house as opposed to your father. Women were expected to obey their fathers, but not just their fathers, their husbands and their sons as well. So in this patriarchal society, a woman was or had less status than her son. So the social classes of the Shang dynasty, excuse me, individuals would have been divided into nobility and peasants. The nobility would have been the landowning folks, and the peasants would have been the people who lived on and worked that land that the others, the nobility, owned. So religiously, in the Shang dynasty, they revered and worshipped family spirits. So they might pray to or ask for assistance from a spirit of a dead ancestor. Ancestor worship is basically what we call that. And they also believed in a supreme god, which was called Shangdi, or probably Shangdi. One of the interesting religious activities was the use of oracle bones. So the Shang Chinese would take bones and they would put them in a fire until they cracked, and then they would interpret those cracks in the bones, and they would get religious meaning or religious messages from those cracks. So Chinese writing, ancient Chinese writing, there was no link between the written language and speaking. So reading something and saying something were two different things. And my point here is that it would be like reading in English, but speaking in French. We talk in French, but we read in English. You could read Chinese without being able to speak it. Just like, somebody might be able to read English without knowing how to pronounce it or how to speak it. Another good analogy here is the idea of numbers. 2 plus 2 equals 4. So we can read that. We can see the symbols 2 plus 2 equals 4 and understand that without actually knowing the words 2 plus 2 equals 4. So the fact that Chinese language was separate from its written language helped unify a large diversity. Okay, so you had all different types of languages going on in ancient China, but all those different languages, all those different people were unified by a single written form of Chinese. One of the other interesting things about the Chinese writing was that there were some 1,500 characters that somebody needed to learn in order to be considered literate. So imagine that. Imagine having to have to know the meaning of 1,500 characters, 1,500, as opposed to just the 26 maybe that we have to know for English. In order to be scholarly, to have a great grasp of the language, you need to know somewhere around 10,000 characters. So the Shang dynasty was overthrown eventually by the Zhou dynasty. And this happened for a number of reasons. It is this overthrow of the Shang dynasty where the Chinese developed this concept of a mandate of heaven. The idea of the mandate of heaven is that a Chinese ruler has the blessing or has the divine right to rule. And in the case of this overthrow of the Shang dynasty, the Zhou ruler believed that he had the blessing from heaven. He had the divine right to rule. And this created what we call as the dynastic cycle. So we'll talk about that here in a second. All right, so the mandate of heaven and the dynastic cycle are two things that are related, and both of those came about when the Zhou overthrew the Shang. So the Zhou dynasty ruled through feudalism. The nobility, the landowners, would give land to lessers, and in return, those lessers would promise loyalty and military service. So if I'm a landowner and I've got a guy here that's got a nice little army, I can give him some land, and in return he will give me loyalty, and his soldiers will fight for me. Technology and trade. The Zhou dynasty built roads and canals. They introduced coins. Okay, so coins is the idea that instead of me, I want your pig, and instead of me having to trade my cow for your pig, I can simply give you some coins, which you could in turn use those coins to buy a cow. The Zhou dynasty also uses blast furnaces and cast iron. Okay, so they are able to use iron. Okay, blast furnace is what heats up the iron ore hot enough to create a material that you can mold into tools. So the blast furnace is the process by which you can use cast iron, or make cast iron, I should say. So here's the dynastic cycle. You have a strong dynasty. They're doing a great job, but eventually the dynasty declines. It becomes corrupt. They have to raise taxes. The rulers grow weak. And then you might have some disasters like a flood or a famine or a peasant revolt. And so this dynasty that once was seen as strong is now seen as weak. They've lost the mandate of heaven. And so rebellion is justified. The dynasty is overthrown. Through rebellion and bloodshed, a new dynasty emerges. So the Shang dynasty is overthrown and the Zhou dynasty emerges. The Zhou dynasty gains power, it gains popularity, it restores peace and order, and eventually it is here. It's a strong dynasty. But it's a cycle, so the Zhou will in time grow weak and be overthrown, and so on and so forth throughout the course of Chinese history. So, exactly. We have the period of warring states. Eventually the Zhou dynasty would lose control of its nobility. The Zhou emperor could no longer command and control the landowners, the nobility. And these landowners, another thing you could call them, were warlords, okay, because they have these armies at their disposal. So warlords began to claim to be the king of their own particular territories. And you have a lot of warfare between these little feudal territories. These warlords are fighting each other for control of China. During this time in Chinese history, you have a decline in values. There's much less order, harmony, respect. All of that is lost, and it is replaced with chaos. And so as a result of this warring states period, you have the introduction of 3 ethical systems. The first is Confucianism. We'll come back to that. The second one is Taoism or Taoism, and the third one is legalism. All right, just looking ahead there. So I'm going to go quick here. I've only got about 4 minutes. Confucianism was founded by Confucius. The Chinese are going to restore order through 5 basic relationships. The way people treat each other is going to improve, and therefore Chinese society is going to improve. I'll let you read the details of that. Important to Confucianism, family and filial piety. Okay, the family is most important. Filial piety is also important. Okay, and then we have education, very important to Confucianism. Confucius believed that people needed to learn. They needed to be educated. Education was key to transforming a bad person into a good person. Education would make that difference. We have Taoism or Taoism. So this is the idea that there is a force, not like Star Wars force, but similar. But there's a force that controls all things. And when humans work against that force or against nature, they throw things off balance. And so that's why China was in such a big problem. The people were out of balance. And then the third one is legalism, which is the idea that the government should use law and order to end disorder. So strict laws are going to be passed, strict punishments are going to be given to people who break those laws, and that's how we're going to keep control. People that act well are going to get rewarded. People that misbehave are going to be punished harshly. So we'll call this one quits for today, and we'll maybe catch up with the last part on the Qin Dynasty next time.